Okay, today's review is Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, a fair and balanced look at the right by Franken. Now, this is part of my scripted book review series in which I kind of go back and reread some of the old reviews I've written ages ago on my blog and try to make a YouTube video out of them. This is something I read back in 2003. I think that's when this book came out. Or was it the year before? It was around then. I really loved this book at the time. In fact, I've been going through my archives and I've written about it not once, but several times. So I'm going to have possibly lots of stuff to read about this book that I wrote back then. What appealed to me most about this book, so first of all, it was funny. And I think this was kind of right at the beginning where we were just beginning to get a lot of our political polemics from comedians. I mean, this was kind of right at the time when Jon Stewart was really beginning to come into his own in 2003. And it was still kind of like, you know, you'd always had like political debate, but to have comedians kind of take the lead in the political debate, I think was still relatively new at this point, or I don't know. Correct me if I'm remembering it wrong. So, you know, I've always been a sucker for a good polemic. I identified as a liberal back then, so I kind of, and still do now. So I loved a good political polemic, but then one that was really funny as well. And I found this book really funny. I mean, I'm reading it and I'm just kind of chuckling to myself, or I'm thinking, oh boy, that line's really good. And then, you know, I don't know, there's something about kind of reading something funny or seeing something funny. The first thing you want to do is share it with somebody. I don't know why we have this impulse, but it's almost like you feel like, oh boy, this is a waste if I can't tell anyone. So I think that's some of the reasons I was blogging about the book or kind of talking about it to people in person and stuff. But the other thing about this book is it was just really eye-opening. Franken in the book kind of goes through a lot of things that kind of on Fox News at the time, or he kind of goes through the books that were published by kind of right-wing pundits at the time, like Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter. He actually kind of goes through and reads their books. And he picks out all the dishonest things they're doing with statistics. So like half the time they're not like lying per se, but they're playing all these games with the numbers to kind of make it look like something when it's really something else. And so he kind of walks you through and say, okay, now these are the numbers they're quoting. Now this is the sample they got it from. Now they discarded all of this stuff because that would have put the results something they didn't want. You know, just kind of all these games they were playing with the numbers. Now, maybe some of this was a little bit unfair. It was unfair maybe in the sense that Franken gave the impression that it's only the right-wing people who do it, and probably there are people on the left who do it just as much. I mean, let's try and be fair about this. Or I don't know. Let me know what you think. Maybe the right wing does it more. But irregardless, it gave you kind of a sense of how much these statistics and numbers can be played with if you want to write a polemic. So in that sense, it was a very good kind of education. At the time, I considered it somewhat of a revelation that these people would be so dishonest. I mean, like, I knew Fox News was biased, but I figured they'd just kind of be, I figured they'd have their bias. I didn't figure they'd be deceitful quite so much, which was another reason this book made such a big impression on me. You're like, oh wow, they are really being dishonest now here. I think back in 2003, that was still something that kind of shocked me. Now I just assume everything on Fox News is just completely dishonest, and everything that Sean Hannity writes was just completely dishonest. Anyways, going through here, I've got a number of things I wrote about the book, starting with kind of the first post I wrote right after I bought the book. So, from November 3, 2003, book recommendations. So when I was in Fukuoka City the other day, I took advantage of being in a big city to pick up some English books. I got the new Michael Moore book, Dude, Where's My Country? And L. Franken's Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, a fair and balanced look at the right. I guess I'm just a sucker for a good polemic. But although I'm dumb enough to like this kind of stuff, I am still smart enough to take it with a grain of salt. I mean, I realize that Michael Moore is just essentially the Rush Limbaugh of the left, and that he's probably every bit as sneaky and misleading as Rush Limbaugh is. But the L. Franken book was really interesting. L. Franken essentially goes through a lot of stuff written by Ann Coulter, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, etc., and points out all the sneaky tricks they use. Now again, I don't want to give the impression I'm taken in by this completely. I am smart enough to realize he's picking on the weakest links in the right-wing chain here. I mean, Ann Coulter. Does anyone take Ann Coulter seriously? And I realize that someone on the right could probably write a similar book about all the idiots on the left. But still, it is interesting, L. Franken's book, the way he shows all the sneaky tricks that these people use, such as the sleight of hands with footnotes that they use, misleading phrases. And being aware of all these tricks that are out there, I think, leads to good critical reading skills, whether one wants to critique the right or the left. So for that reason, I recommend this book to anyone, left or right. That reason, and it's just funny. One of the few books that made me laugh out loud when I was just sitting alone in my apartment reading it. Okay, so that's the post I wrote initially on it. Now there was a expatriate magazine, newspaper kind of thing, and a prefecture where they just took submissions. And I requested to review this book in that newspaper, and they took my submission. So here's the review that I wrote then and that ran in the newspaper. L. Franken's book review. I really enjoyed L. Franken's latest satire on the American political right, called Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them. In fact, it was one of those rare books that was so funny, I found myself laughing out loud while reading it, which caused me to have to make repeated apologies in my office. But then after I finished reading it, I went online to look up reviews of this book, and I noticed an interesting pattern emerging. People who agreed with Franken's politics found him really funny. People who disagreed with his politics would often complain, and the worst part was that it wasn't even funny. So I found it very funny, but maybe that's just showing my bias. I don't know. Now, anyone who has ever sat next to me in the bar, or ridden in a car with me, or been stuck in an elevator with me, or passed me in the hallway, was probably left with little doubt about my politics and my dislike for the American right wing. But in spite of that, I'm going to do my best to be fair in reviewing this book. In a chapter entitled, I Bitch Slap Bernie Goldberg, L. Franken satirizes Bernie Goldberg's book about liberal bias in the American media. Now, this is a frequent refrain of the American right. They're always complaining about liberal bias in the American media. Franken comes up with an interesting analogy. Franken says, I'll admit that from the hundreds of thousands of hours of broadcast news over the last 3 decades, Bernie is able to cobble together a few instances of liberally slanted reporting. But even when Goldberg seems to have a point, it feels just the teensiest bit selective. It's like accusing a library of having a murder mystery bias after only going to the murder mystery shelf. That same analogy could well be applied to Franken himself. He ignores any intelligent voices on the American right and only writes about the idiots, such as Ann Coulter or Bill O'Reilly. And of these idiots, he only quotes them when they say something stupid. Franken's targets certainly give him no lack of material to work with, and they undoubtedly deserve the satirizing he gives them. But the reader is left with the impression that the entire American right is represented by the quotes in Franken's book. Now, in reality, even Spinsanity was a website at the time that was like a fact-checking website, which was the source for much of Franken's critiques against Ann Coulter. Even they acknowledge that, quote, if you can leave aside all of Ann Coulter's fabrications, admittedly not an easy task, Coulter is actually driving at something important about the state of political debate in the media. End quote. But Coulter isn't quoted in Franken's book when she is telling the truth, only when he catches her lying. But at this point we come full circle, because L. Franken is not a serious political commentator, but rather a comedian. If you want a serious discussion of the state of the American right wing, you won't find it here. But if you are looking for a really funny satire of some of the less intelligent rhetoric of the American right, I recommend this book. And although I'm sure the right has no monopoly on dishonesty, it is amazing the number of lies Franken catches these guys making. I'll certainly never listen to any political commentator in the same way again. Even President Bush is caught telling several lies in Franken's book. Or perhaps I should say, especially President Bush. Franken really uncovers a lot of untruths that President Bush says. Now, although this book is about American politics, the fact that it has also become a bestseller in Britain indicates that you don't necessarily have to be an American to enjoy it. I added that part because I was writing for a prefectural magazine in Japan where there was expats from all countries. Also of interest is L. Franken's previous book, Rush Limbaugh is a Big Fat Idiot, which is a satire of the infamous right-wing radio commentator. That one's somewhat dated. I think that came out in the mid-90s. But it's a good read and you can find it in the local library. Okay, so those are my two reviews. I did actually lean heavily on this book for another blog post I did kind of later that year, which I think was called, I Don't Think George Bush is a Christian. This was the George W. Bush, the second Bush. So I had a number of points where I basically arguing, I don't think he's really a Christian. I think this is just kind of an act to fool Christians to vote for him. And item 3 and item 4 on my list both came from L. Franken's book. Item 3, I kind of paraphrase what he says. And item 4, I just quote the book directly and just quote it at length. So I'll just kind of read through those parts here. Item 3, paraphrasing what I got out of Franken's book. In January 2000, Bush was interviewed by Jonathan Alter and Howard Freeman. Since Bush's campaign had been claiming Bush read the Bible, Feynman asked him what Bible passage he had read that day. According to Alter, instead of answering the question, Bush got really angry at this point and answered, You know something? I think you're trying to catch me as to whether or not I can remember where I was in the Bible. I tend to believe that if Bush was really reading the Bible every day, he would have just simply answered the question. Certainly he must have known that politically that would have been the wisest move. His campaign was already making a big deal about how he read the Bible every day, so he wasn't shy about using that kind of thing for political gain. And then item 4. Now this one comes directly from L. Franken's book, which I quote at length on my blog and hope that it falls under fair use, even though it's a bit of a lengthy quotation. But I'll read it out here again because I think this is interesting. This is L. Franken describing his evening at a White House Correspondents' Dinner. So begin the quotation. I had my most interesting and perhaps most significant conversation that night with Commerce Secretary Don Evans. Evans is among Bush's closest friends and was featured heavily in Howard Feynman's Newsweek cover story, Bush and God. That was the top-selling Newsweek since 9/11. As you probably know, until his 40th birthday, Bush was a heavy drinker. Or as we call them at Harvard, a drunk. According to many accounts, Bush was also an obnoxious drunk. Finally, Laura Bush laid down the law. Threatened with losing sex from his wife, Bush decided to quit drinking and turn to Christ. That part about sex is not in the Newsweek article. It was Evans, a fellow oilman, who coaxed his old friend George into joining a Bible study group in Midland. According to Newsweek, it was a spiritual boot camp, an intensive year-long study of a single book of the New Testament, each week a new chapter, with detailed reading and discussion in a group of 10 men. For 2 years, Bush and Evans and their partners read the writings of the Gentile physician Luke Acts, and then his gospel. Now, I'm a Jew. This is quoting Franklin. I'm a Jew, and I grew up knowing zip about the New Testament, and still know next to zip. But as it so happened, a few days before the correspondence dinner, I ran into economist Paul Solman at the Harvard gym. Paul is also a Jew, but an educated one, so he knows the Bible. He too had read Feynman's cover story. He told me he found it ironic that Acts was one of the 2 books Bush and Evans had studied. Acts, Paul told me, is Luke's account of the formation of the church after Jesus' death. The book is almost a socialist tract, full of admonishment to the rich to share their wealth with the poor. I saw Evans sitting alone at his table. I sidled into the seat next to him. Mr. Secretary, do you mind if I speak with you? Not at all, Al. I liked him immediately. After some niceties, I steered the conversation toward Acts and how its message seemed at odds with the shape of the Bush tax cut. I led into it with, "Did you read Howard Feynman's cover story in Newsweek on Bush and God?" "Yes," Evans said. "Did you like it?" "Yes." "So did I said. "So you know what Acts is about?" Evans looked a little uncomfortable. Long pause. Then, "No." It was a spiritual boot camp, an intensive year-long study of a single book of the New Testament, each week a new chapter with detailed reading and discussion in a group of 10 men. For 2 years, Bush and Evans and their partners read the writings of the Gentile physician Luke Acts and then his gospel. No. Based on what Paul Solman had told me, and a subsequent glance at the Complete Idiot's Guide to the Life of Christ, I explained to the scriptural boot camp survivor what I understood Acts to be about. Then I went into my spiel about the unfairness of the tax cut. "Ah," Evans smiled, "but Acts also has Jesus' parable of the talents." "No," I said, "that's in Matthew." I've noticed that the only biblical parable supply-siders ever mention is talents. And for all I can tell, it might be the only one Evan knows. But even I was surprised Evans didn't know what book it was from. What do you suppose those 10 guys were really doing during their spiritual boot camp? Watching football? Eating pretzels? Plotting with Karl Rove how to use religious rhetoric to assure the Christian right that George W. was one of them? End quotation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Al Franken is a polemic, and so he's unreliable. And in the interest of full disclosure, item 3 came from Franken's book also. But that item was Franken quoting another source, whereas this whole story is dependent only on Franken's say-so. So if you don't want to believe it, fair enough. But I tend to believe that since this book was published by a major publisher, And since it became a #1 bestseller, there would have been a lawsuit if this story was apocryphal, or at the very least a correction by Don Evans. I couldn't find a counter story by Don Evans. A Yahoo search for Don Evans and L. Franken only turns up more instances of L. Franken telling this story several other times in interviews and TV appearances. Which again would further make you think that if it were completely untrue, a lawsuit or something would have happened. Okay, even if it's true, it's about Evans, not Bush. Although as L. Franken indicates, Evans' complete ignorance of the book he supposedly studied for 2 years indicates that these Bible studies never really took place, and by extension, then that Bush or somebody in his campaign lied about it. Okay, so that last part was just an extended quotation from the book on kind of a narrower subject, but hopefully you get the idea. I'll finish up here.